Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to the 13th meeting of the Welfare Reform Committee. Can I start by asking everyone to ensure that they have their mobile phones and Blackberries and other technical equipment switched off, and also start by putting in Jamie Hepburn's apologies. Jamie's phoned this morning to say that he's ill. Before we move to the main items on our agenda this morning, we have one short piece of administrative business, and that's agenda item 1. And the purpose of that item is to invite the committee to agree to take an item of business in private later in the meeting. Specifically, the committee is invited to agree that consideration of agenda item 5 is taken in private. This agenda item relates to a discussion about a future visit to Atos Assessment Centre. Our members agreed that we discuss that in private? Agreed. Thank you. We now then come to agenda item 2, which is an evidence session looking at the housing issues that are anticipated to arise following the introduction of universal credit, such as direct payment of housing benefit to tenants and the introduction of new rules on under-occupancy in the social rented sector. I welcome our witnesses to the committee this morning. They are Ken Milroy, the Chief Executive of Aberdeen Foyer, Helen Barton, Customer Services Director of Albyn Housing Society, and Ian Ballantyne, Chief Executive of Scottish Veterans Housing Association. Welcome all to the committee. To start the session, I'd like to invite each of you to introduce themselves and to provide a short summary of the key issues for each of your own organisations on the forthcoming welfare reforms. Once you've had that opportunity, I'll then invite the committee to ask questions, and we'll get into a discussion around the points that have been raised. Okay, so I don't know if you've agreed amongst yourselves who's going to go first. It will be ladies first, I'm not sure.
Okay, we haven't agreed, but I'll take the opportunity. Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me along to speak to you today. As you've heard, I work for Albyn Housing Society, which is a housing association working in the north of Scotland, operating across most of the Highland Council and part of Moray District Council area. We're coming up to our 40th anniversary, and we have over 2,700 rented homes, just to give you a little bit of context, operating across more than 60 different towns and villages in the Highlands, and a mixture of urban areas with very high levels, some areas within the top 15% of deprivation, but also some very fragile rural remote communities as well. Characterised by relatively low levels of housing benefit, but very low incomes, very high fuel and transport costs, a significant issue with fuel poverty across the area, and very limited housing options in most of our areas. And just to put things into context, to travel from one end of our area of operation to the other would take roughly 3 hours by car. So simply moving people from one house to another community isn't an option. Which brings our three main concerns are under occupation, direct payments, and the digital claims process. So the geographic context there brings me on to my first point, which is around the under occupation issue. This is a particular concern for rural associations like ourselves. As I've said, the levels of benefit claimants are relatively low. We're about 50% of our tenants are in receipt of either full or partial housing benefit. But we are very exposed to the under-occupancy rules. The proportion of our tenants who under-occupy properties is very high. Most of our stock is 2 or 3 bedroom properties. Only a quarter is 1 bedroom or bedsit properties. And because the rules are being applied retrospectively, we have a high proportion of tenants who are already under-occupying homes for a wide variety of reasons. Some of that's been because we have deliberately been encouraged to and have wanted to build at least 2 bedroom properties in our communities to provide greater flexibility, especially in smaller areas where the opportunities for moving when circumstances change are more limited. We have older stock, as I say, we're coming up to 40 years old. We have older stock where people have gone in with families, family circumstances have changed, and people have been left in family houses. And we have a high proportion of single people on our housing list. Over half of our housing list is single people. So if we didn't allow them to apply for 2 bedroom properties, we simply wouldn't be able to meet those needs. So if we were to make all our smaller properties available to meet under occupation and to transfer people for under occupation, that would undoubtedly have a severe impact on our ability as a partner to the Highland Housing Register and meeting homeless need across the Highlands. So there is a shared concern across all the landlords there. The second concern I mentioned was in direct payments, and for us this is really the great unknown. We will have over a third of our tenants will have to make payments that they don't make now. We simply don't know what access they have to bank accounts that would be able to facilitate standing orders, direct debits. Access to credit unions is limited. We have a credit union that operates across the Western Isles and the Highlands. We don't know how many of our tenants already have accounts with that credit union, or whether they're going to be able to gear up quickly enough to provide the sorts of facilities that our tenants might need. The onus of that means the shift is proving is likely to be extremely time consuming in terms of the support requirements for our own staff in providing support and guidance for tenants, in helping them to set up accounts and also managing if payments don't come through. So we're anticipating that that's likely to be a major additional resource requirement for us to help with personal contact, to help people work their way through that change process. And last but not least is the digital claims process is a particular concern to us again in the rural area. Again, we have very limited information about exactly what the availability of personal internet access is for our tenants, but we do ask in our resident satisfaction surveys, and from those people who choose to reply to us, the indications are that it's at best around 50% and that it decreases with age. So given that our profile of the working age population tends to be the older working age population, again, that's a concern to us. There are also serious infrastructure obstacles in terms of web access not being, and internet access not being consistent across the whole of the rural area. Public access points are limited, and there's a particular issue of confidentiality in public access points in small communities and rural areas. And our colleagues who have set up internet access availability in their offices have found uptake has been very, very low because of those sorts of issues. So the overall impact of all that is that for us, the cost of making the system work is we perceive being shunted onto landlords, being shunted onto us to provide the support to our tenants to help them through that process. We have a very high customer care ethos, and we will do everything we can to support the most vulnerable members of our communities. But this is at a time of converging pressures on increased loan costs, reducing development costs, reduced ability to build new, smaller houses, SHQS requirements, and high levels of fuel poverty. Happy to discuss the things that we've done so far and to answer particular questions, but I think that would be my outline of the main issues for us.
Yeah, thanks very much.
So far.
Gentlemen, do you want to make a contribution? Mr. Milroy? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Again, thanks for the invitation to address the committee. I'm the Chief Executive of Aberdeen Foyer, and amongst other activities, we're a registered housing support provider working in Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire region. I also chair a Scottish Government supported accommodation group that was set up at the request of Scottish Ministers to provide recommendations to a cross-sectoral group of stakeholders on supported accommodation in Scotland, and specifically to consider implementation of recommendations from a report on supported accommodation from a group chaired by Linda McTavish, Principal of Annie's Land College in Glasgow, and I was also a member of that working group. As a housing support provider, the Foyer operates 80 supported tenancies across 7 different sites across our region. And in our case, we target those aged 16 to 25-year-olds, all of whom have been homeless and have presented to the local authority and referred on to us. Access to our services is now wholly 100% nominations from the local authority. So our service is very much tied in with the local authority and meeting its statutory responsibilities around homelessness. We opened our first housing support service in 1998 in Aberdeen. The Foyer is one of hundreds of housing support services operating across Scotland, either by third sector organisations like us, housing associations or councils. In our case, our service is focused on those who have been homeless. However, housing support is also provided in a number of other key policy areas of interest to the Scottish Government, including care leavers, those with addiction issues, those with an offending history and veterans. All to a greater or lesser extent will be affected by changes in the welfare system. It's a matter of some concern, I think, that we don't know at a Scottish level the number of people living in supported accommodation. The last information that I could get a hold of was 2007-2008, and that was in association with the implementation of the Supporting People regime. At that time, there was 9,300 people in supported accommodation. I've no doubt that the sector has evolved since 2007, 2008, but I think that's an area of work that the Scottish Government should try and take forward with local authorities and the regulator, so that we've got a handle at a national level in terms of the numbers and the different groups that are now residing in supported accommodation, and ensure that we've got broader planning framework really to take account of the welfare reform changes. Linked to that, I think, is a definition of supported accommodation. The supported accommodation group that I've been chairing is of the view that any definition of supported accommodation should include housing support within mainstream tenancies, and not just support provided in dedicated accommodation. So accommodation with floating support as well. It would be a matter, I think, of concern if the DWP were overly restrictive and excluded some of the models that we've considered as best practice. And I think there's a need to ensure that the definitions that are adopted reflect the good practice that we've seen across Scotland. The initial activity provided by housing support provider through the former Supporting People funding regime was, in my view, overly prescriptive and limited, and not in line at all, I think, with the person-centred approach favoured by providers and commissioners today. Housing support, as previously defined, omitted to include such activity as employability support and well-being. And I think they have to move centre stage in terms of addressing some of the, or mitigating the issues around welfare reform. So I think definition is an important aspect that needs to be clarified. The committee, I think, will be aware that DWP have not included supported accommodation within the initial universal credit implementation arrangements, but is seeking to have a new system in place for 2014-15. Any new system must recognise costs of operating supported accommodation and ideally pass associated funds to the Scottish Government and then most likely on to local authorities. Again, a clear definition of supported accommodation will be essential if we're to correctly size the pot, if that's the way things go. In developing any new system, I believe that we should be, in the sector, proactive to seek to work with the DWP to test some projects and ways of working, and to help shape what that new system looks like to ensure continuation of the sector in Scotland. It needs to be specifically focused on supported accommodation and ensure that any changes are understood by service commissioners and regulators. This would ensure the differing legal and policy framework was being taken fully into account. The supported accommodation group, I'm sure, would be happy to give some guidance in relation to this. For those who move on from supported accommodation, my concerns are similar to my colleague in relation to the bedroom tax, as it were, and the additional costs on the individual. I think we should be looking at some kind of transitional arrangements when people are moving on from accommodation-based services. I think we need to do that to avoid repeat homelessness. There's a lot of good work has been done around homelessness across the country, and I would hate to see that go backwards. We need to prepare individuals to move on, and that needs to be a critical part of their housing support service. That needs to be planned and needs to be multi-agency. I think there will be, and again has already been mentioned, restrictions in area choice and limited single-person accommodation. And that may mean that there's only 2-bedroom properties available, and that would, as I've mentioned, likely incur additional costs on the individual. I guess there could be use of the discretionary housing payment fund that's to be devolved to local authorities to assist in those cases. But I think the fund will be under considerable pressure, and it may be that guidance might be issued to local authorities in terms of specific groups and priorities over and above anything provided by DWP. I think that would be all the kind of key issues I would want to highlight at this stage. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr Milroy. Mr Ballantyne, you want to give us
Once
your
again,
perspective?
Ian Ballantyne, my role as the Chief Executive of the Scottish Veterans Housing Association. Thank you for inviting me along. The majority of the points that I was going to raise have been raised by my colleagues, but specifically towards veterans, Scottish Veterans Housing Association has a very narrow field. We look after vulnerable veterans who are homeless, and we only do it in Edinburgh and in Broughty Ferry, Dundee. Our aim is to try and transition those vulnerable veterans back into mainstream accommodation. We do that by having 2 hostels, albeit over the last few years we've spent several millions of pounds transferring the accommodation into good quality. So we've tried to take the S out of hostel. The key being, the first thing we have to do is to make sure that when people come to us, they feel safe, they feel secure, and they have a future. And that's why we have these 2 accommodations. The key we find at the present time is we have to make sure that we can get people into our accommodation, we can provide the service that they need, and that comes at a cost, that comes at a considerable cost, because we have to meet all the qualifications required by an organisation like the Care Commission to make sure we have the correct staff at the correct levels, providing the correct service to our veterans. Once we've got them in, we then, obviously, as I said, try to move them on. Where do we move them on to? As my colleagues to the right and left have said, there is no single accommodation around these days. And what worries us considerably, people certainly on Job Seekers Allowance who are trying to survive on £68 or so a week, where do they go? One of the keys for veterans, when veterans get together, they do find solace and companionship, and they find that they can discuss the problems with veterans and people who are veterans orientated. So we get them to the point of transition, and they're ready to move on. And we have serious issues where they move to. As an organisation, we have developed some flats in Edinburgh and Dundee to do that, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. To help the transition, we're about to start building 51 flats through in Edinburgh. But once again, these are transition flats. We will try and move people through them. The problem comes at the end. In hostel, you move them out. Where do we move them to? There simply is not appropriate accommodation out there. So my key concerns, certainly initially, are with the current situation whereby the housing benefit, for example, is paid direct to the tenant. While we're in supported accommodation, that is not going to be a problem because that's currently exempt. But when they move on to the accommodation, the move-on accommodation that we provide, they will have to meet that themselves. And my concern is it puts an extra strain on people we've just got transitioned, and where do we put them? Where do we put them? The second one is the availability, as I said earlier, of accommodation to help support the residents, and how do they pay for that? Because £60 a week will not pay for anything, and I'd be very loath to see them going into accommodation to share with total strangers, because the great danger is they will revert back to the situation we have, and what we have is redevelop this perpetual homelessness. So that's really the areas of very limited to the areas of concern that we have.
Thanks very much, Mr Ballantyne, and thanks to you all for bringing those points to our attention. I'll open up to the committee to ask some questions and develop them a bit further, but I'll kick off by asking one question that's occurred to me. Speaking to the organisation that's involved in the pilot programme, this was highlighted to us. Information sharing is key to identifying each individual's needs and what support and assistance might be required from you as organisations supporting those people. Could you give us an idea of the current level or situation in terms of information sharing? What practical difficulties you envisage coming about as we move towards universal credit, and any concerns that you have around this? It would be quite helpful for us to know that at the outset. Mr Milroy.
We have a number of data sharing arrangements in place with the local authority in terms of the nominations that are made to us, but also with other external agencies like Skills Development Scotland, where we're providing employability services. So there are already models there in terms of data sharing and avoiding reinventing the wheel, as it were. So I think there are some models there. I would hope we could build on those, but my experience is that's once those are in place, they're working well.
We've some experience of data sharing. We're a partner to a common housing register, and the common housing register is jointly operated with the Highland Council and the other housing associations based in the Highlands. So we already have an ethos of data sharing in terms of applicants and housing stock and housing need. We've also good working relationships on the whole with the housing benefits staff at the Highland Council, and there's certainly a willingness there to share data, and we've had early meetings with them to discuss what sort of data we will need to exchange. There is a practical difficulty in that the Housing Benefits Department itself is extremely pressured, and their systems aren't readily set up to simply press a button and provide us with the information that we're needing. So whilst the willingness is there, the practical availability of information is taking some time to come through, and all the time the clock's ticking, and we're getting closer and closer to implementation. So we've managed to source a lot of the information ourselves in terms of under occupation from our own household details, and whilst we try and keep that up to date, we've no guarantees that it's entirely up to date. So there's a lot of work we're having to do ourselves in terms of household audits and telephone censuses and things to try and make sure that we've got details up to date, because we can't afford to wait for that information on housing benefit household details to come through to us. We need to start now, and we need to be able to start make personal contact with the tenants who we think are at risk now. So the willingness is there, but the practical availability of it is limited. I'd say we've concerns as well about what the implications are of the eventual move over to the universal credit system, and how and where that system will be operated, because whilst we have good working relationships with our colleagues at the local authority, that's not going to be there once universal credit is fully implemented, and we've major concerns about how we will be able to operate and who we'll be operating with, and that information simply isn't available to us yet as to how that's going to work, and what access we as a landlord will have to check details so that we can provide assistance and support tenants who are having difficulties with claims through that process.
Yeah, I would say we have a very good working relationship with the local authorities. Certainly that data transfer is not a problem. I'm very fortunate in so much as we see our residents and our tenants, because we've only got 25 tenants, but we've got 120 residents in our hostels. We see them on a daily basis, so we can keep the information flow going. The area of concern, as we raised earlier, is the initial signing on to the new universal credit, how that's going to be done. What the link is at the present time. If we have an issue with housing benefit, we pick up the phone and we phone Susie in housing benefit, we get an answer and the problem's solved. On the new system, because it's an online system, you online to Belfast today, Cardiff tomorrow, London the next day. My concern is the continuity, and plus the fact, as a provider, we will not be able to directly access that. It will have to be the individual. So the individual will be asking us, we'll be telling them the answer to go back, but hopefully we can get that loop squared away. I don't believe in many cases our residents will be fit to do that task, and linked, as it was raised by my colleague earlier, many of our residents will simply not be able to open a bank account. I mean, that's a fact today, and I don't see that changing through just lack of capacity to be able to do it.
I think that was one of the things that came through strongly, this move to the responsibility falling on the individual recipient of the benefit to keep people advised and informed might create a disconnect between those people, yourselves and the housing departments. So, I mean, obviously you've identified that potential's there, so that confirms the concerns that we had raised with us. Okay, I'll open up to the committee now to Alex and then Kevin.
Thank you very much, Convener. The question I wanted to raise relates to matching housing stock to demand. Now, one of the characteristics we've seen in over recent decades is a massive shift towards single occupancy households. And I think it was Helen Barton who said that, did you say half of all your tenants?
Half of our housing list are single applicants.
Yes.
Probably about half our tenants as well, yeah.
Mm-hmm. How did we get to a situation where single occupancy households have become such a high proportion of households who require support, and yet the housing stock doesn't match that demand? Have we been making the wrong decisions in terms of how the houses we provide, or have we simply been failing to respond to markets?
I don't think we've been making the wrong decisions. I think the decisions to provide accommodation that's flexible enough to meet people's changing circumstances has been the right decision, particularly in areas where you're talking about very limited availability of social housing stock, and the opportunities to move to other accommodation simply aren't there. In a lot of our rural areas, for example, other housing options are very, very limited. There is a very low proportion of private rented accommodation in areas out with Inverness City, where rented stock is available. It's very much geared towards the holiday market rather than long-term private rentals. And houses that come up for sale are generally not affordable to the local populations whose incomes are based on tourism and local service industries. So I think the decisions to build 2-bedroom plus stock on the whole have been the right decisions. Why we have so many single households is a difficult one for me to answer, but I mean my gut instinct is it's a mixture of demographics and social change that have happened progressively over a number of years. I think with the best will in the world, even whilst our development programmes were very buoyant, we simply wouldn't have been able to build enough houses to meet. We've never been able to build enough houses to meet the demand and the growing demands that are out there. I think the very positive changes in homelessness legislation that the Parliament have brought through over the last 10 years have played a part as well, in that single people have better access to housing and to the housing list than they have done in the past. And I see that as a welcome change. I don't see it as a negative change. But we're not able to build sufficient stock in the right places to keep pace with that. So a combination of factors that have led us there, in my view.
If we were to take a snapshot of what you're doing right now, are you at the moment responding to the increased demand for single accommodation by planning to provide more single accommodation, or are you not doing that at the moment?
We are, yes, where we can. However, our development programme has reduced from just over 300 properties in the last year or so. Next year it will be less than 30. So our ability to do that is extremely limited.
Thank you.
Okay. Kevin.
Thank you, Convener, and can I welcome you today and thank you for giving evidence to the committee. Convener, I'd like to start off with supported accommodation issues, and I'd like to put on record my thanks to Ken Milroy and his staff at the Foyer, as well as many others in Aberdeen, for helping me get my head round some of the issues here. Ken, you recently wrote to me saying that you have great concern for the safety and well-being of individuals with addiction issues if they're to be paid 4 weekly in arrears. Could you expand on that for the committee, please?
Really, the inability to manage the finances would be the major concern. and we've seen people with addiction issues, for instance, when they come out of prison, low tolerance, and we see drug deaths. And I think the circumstances of funds coming to an individual, not to a landlord, if they are in a vulnerable situation, we could potentially see an increase in overdoses in terms of people with addiction issues. We've done a straw poll of people that we are currently working with in terms of recovery programmes, and this is by no means scientific, but in terms of those that we're working with, you know, what would they have done if they got their money? Would they have paid their rent, or would they have bought drugs with it? And the answer has been they would have bought drugs. So I don't know why we would want to put individuals that are clearly vulnerable in a more difficult situation by that mechanism of payment. So it's just a fear that we have, and I think it's, it's grounded on the experience we've got in working with that client group.
Thank you. In terms of your current setup and a lot of the accommodation that you provide, where housing benefit is paid directly to you guys at this moment in time, but you charge individual residents £5 a week, if I remember rightly, for their fuel and electricity. Your staff were saying that sometimes it's very difficult to get that money. How difficult do you think it will be to get the housing benefit money from folks if it's paid directly to them?
Well, I think that will be nigh impossible, to be honest. I mean, the arrangement that we have is that, as well as being the support provider, we're also the landlord, and we think that's the right arrangement. But one way of mitigating that is that we pass the landlord responsibility back to the housing association. Whether the housing association would want that responsibility, and that generally we're providing a probationary tenancy, in effect, for people that will then move on to mainstream tenancies. We're providing a supported environment for that. But it would be impossible, and I think the fact that we are working with individuals who are in need of support, that has to be the focus. That's the commissioned service from the local authority. So the way we would mitigate it, I think, would be to pass the landlord responsibility back to the housing association.
Can I just come in here?
Certainly.
Well, we're actually at the coal face. We deal with people from the age of 17 up to however. And they come to us because they have at least one issue, and the majority of people come with more than one issue. We charge a high rent because we're providing a supporting service in accommodation. So I'm landlord and also support provider. Now, the majority of that rent element is currently paid by housing benefit. It's difficult enough to get from some of our residents the small element that they pay. If they were to suddenly get the whole whack at 4 weeks or 8 weeks, and if there could be a delay in housing benefit under the new universal credit, it's going to go at the speed of the last credit before they get the whole thing, it would be frightening, because you could give a gross alcoholic, of which we have quite a few, a huge amount of money, providing, of course, he can get a bank account to put the money into, or however he does it. And I would support what Ken says. What do I do? Do I go and say, Scottish Veterans Housing Association, I must go and pay my rent? Or will I go down to Jenny's across the road and think about it a second time? So it has serious implications, because the cash flow would not be there for the organisation. If the cash flow is not coming in, you can't pay the staff, you can't run the facility. The facility will close. Where do they go?
It was just that cash flow issue for the organisation. I think a number of housing support providers are small organisations, and it's tight financially. And if there's an impact in terms of the cash flow because of late payment or even delayed payments, then that has serious consequences. I would hate to see that affect some of the smaller organisations.
So for small organisations like yourself, if you're not getting that rent on a regular basis, if you're not getting that cash flow, you're at risk very, very quickly. Yes. And your service disappears, basically.
Yes.
Yeah. Convener, in terms of the UK government, they have said that that there may be some direct payments for vulnerable people, but they've not defined what a vulnerable person actually is. How difficult do the panel actually think it would be to define that vulnerability?
Well, I think there's two elements to it. The one is there's also the talk about what they call exempt accommodation. So if you're living in exempt accommodation, you would agree, you'd think by definition, therefore, you must be vulnerable. And neither of these two elements have actually been agreed. There is an exemption currently in DWP rules. Am I right, Ken? There's an exemption, but it said nobody has said exactly what that exemption will be for property, and nobody's exactly said what vulnerable is. How do you define a vulnerable person?
I think it's potentially a very subjective judgment that needs to be made, and I'm not sure how you would define it. I would say that most of our tenants can be vulnerable at some point during their tenancy, and I think one of the issues is that some people are vulnerable long term, and we certainly have a large number of our tenants who we know have physical and mental health issues, who have addiction issues, who have come through particularly stressful circumstances. But we also have a lot of tenants who can be vulnerable at certain points in their tenancy, because their tenancies hit crisis, their life circumstances change, relationships break down, employment changes, and people will come in and out of vulnerability. So how you define it and how you move people in and out of that, I think, is potentially extremely complex, and also one of the concerns we have in terms of the direct payment for what the triggers will be and when they will come in and out, because I think we could find people falling through the net very, very easily.
People have been referred into our service because they're homeless, so they meet those requirements. But we would undertake an in-depth assessment of their needs and attempt to address that either directly or by engaging in with other agencies. But that would include a whole range of issues around mental health, most certainly around learning, training and employability. So a wide range of different needs in terms of what I would term vulnerability. But I think Kevin's right. There's no clear definition of that.
Something you think that government could define? It would be difficult enough for you guys at the coalface to define who is vulnerable and who is not in some cases. So do you think that government could ever come up with a definition?
And there's been a shift, I think, in the way that services are being provided, and that is around person-centred services, and that's about engaging with individuals and working directly with them. I mean, the Scottish Parliament has put through the self-directed support bill, so I think there is, in terms of the work that's going on currently, quite a focus on individuals and trying to work with them. I think to put a straitjacket on it would be problematic in terms of responding to an individual's needs and looking at what is their potential, what is their opportunity to get out the circumstances that they've been in.
Convener, my last question on this particular topic is round about finding out how many people live in supported accommodation. I actually asked a question of the Minister recently about that, and I understand from Mr Milroy's evidence and from the answer that information is now being put together. But I myself have been working on and asking councils exactly how many folk are in supported accommodation in their area. And again, it comes down to definition. I wonder if you could, from your various fields, give us a definition of what you think supported accommodation is. Does it include supported accommodation for elderly folks, whether that be in sheltered housing or extra supported accommodation?
I mean, the legacy arrangement is that was implemented through the Supporting People Fund, and I think that's probably a useful starting point. That was what I made reference to in my presentation to the committee. So I think that's the useful starting point. I think it's then looking at the commissioning arrangements and whether that's through local authorities would, I think, in the main be the commissioning arrangements through, but the different departments across the local authorities. And I think that will vary from local authority to local authority in terms of the services that are being commissioned. So I don't think we can be overly prescriptive in relation to the definition. I think, I think there's a useful starting point, but how services have moved on, I think that's been fairly significant over the past few years. And I think the work that we've been doing through the supported accommodation group can assist in that. I think there'll be some useful examples of practice within that. So I don't think there's a straight answer, Kevin. I think there's there's a starting point to try and gather that.
I would agree. I mean, as a landlord, our definition of supported accommodation would be accommodation that is designated for particular client groups where support is provided as part of the tenancy condition, effectively. We actually have some of that, but we have less of it now than we did a few years ago because models have moved on and the trend is for support to be provided on a floating basis and to come in and out and not to be strictly linked to the tenancy. So whilst we still have a proportion of our stock that would be let as supported for particular client groups, we will have a whole range of tenants who are receiving support packages at different times during the tenancy, which in many cases we won't even know about because we as the landlord don't need to know about it. It's a personal arrangement between them and the commissioners and the support providers. So, yeah, I think it will be quite difficult to pin down potentially.
I'd agree with that. One of the dangers when we went through the ramifications of transitional housing benefit and supporting people funding came on board, it was okay. But of course, over the years, the supporting people funding the ring fencing has been taken away. So local authorities will use it as they feel. And of course, the level of support, at what point they want to input that funding into the support, varies by local authority. Some look at the more extreme ends of support, whereas others look at maybe the narrower end of support. So it's always been a concern. I'm very, I'd say fortunate, maybe not the right word, but I'm very narrow-guided. We only provide 2 hostels with outreach support as well, but total support inside. And that's part of the occupancy agreement. If they don't need support, then there's no point in coming to us because we need to deal with people who need support. But we do try to transition people, and we do it on an occupancy agreement, not on a Scottish secure tenancy, which is another area of concern for housing support.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Linda, followed by Ian.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. I've got a question for each of you, actually, and if I could start with Ken. It's many years since I visited the Aberdeen Foyer, but I do remember that there were employment initiatives tied to the accommodation. I was very struck by something which you said, which was that you felt that your best practice models could be at risk. And I'm wondering if the holistic approach that's taken at Aberdeen Foyer could now be very much at risk in its implementation with a knock-on effect in all different sorts of areas. Is that a view that you have?
It could be. I mean, by very fact that a way of mitigating the risk around the rent is not to be the landlord, to give that up. And I think it is important in terms of dealing with that group of young people who've been homeless, that we are the landlord and the support provider. That's not a common view across the sector, but that certainly has worked effectively for us in terms of the separation of those two functions. And I think you're right that we do need to not just think about housing support in terms of maintaining a tenancy. It is about how people move on into education, training and employment. And we have always put employability at the centre of the action planning process that we've embarked on. We haven't always had the means to respond to it, whether that was through New Deal activities or other welfare to work activities. But we always attempted to put that at the heart. So anything that's going to erode that, I think, would severely damage our model.
And Ian, I was also aware whilst you were speaking that the Scottish Government had put in place a veterans policy which seems to have been very highly regarded by different groups. And I wonder too if there are any aspects of that that you feel will be at risk by this introduction of universal credit and what comes with it?
Well, it really comes down to who's going to pay the piper. That's the bottom line. We have brought into our organisation, we've brought in outside sources to provide the service. I mean, we as an organisation provide support to a point, but when it comes to employment issues, we've got a secure base where they are just now. We need to get them ready to move on. One of the key issues is to get work. So we are very fortunate with the ex-service organisations. There's regular Forces Employment Association we bring in to do it. We use an organisation like Shelter. We're also using Citizen Advice Bureaus. We bring a lot of agencies in to help us transition people through. My only concern, as I raised earlier, is if direct payment does not come to the landlord for rents, if there's no money coming in to do the basic task, the mill will close down. I mean, it's a bit drastic, but that could be the outcome. But certainly the initiatives that have been put forward, I wholeheartedly support. Certainly one, not necessarily employment, but one looking forward to how do we move people on. I said before that we simply don't have the single people accommodation. And of course, it's not necessarily, we don't always necessarily deal with single people. We also have couples who are transitioning, and some of them have children. So there's other issues. But what we've found now is there's a willingness through COSLA and through SFHA and through the Association of Local Landlords, the Scottish Landlords, we're trying to get protocols into being to get people to move on. Because the greatest thing, before someone can truly transition, they must be someplace, they want to be in the area they want to be in a house they feel safe in, and with a job. Well, we're working to get the first two, and working really hard to get the third one as well. But we've got to use outside sources. It's about data sharing, as Ken said, linking with other organisations who can support us. So, yeah, we've come a long way in the last few years, I've got to admit.
And Helen, I was aware what you talked about the profile of your stock at Albyn Housing Association. Would I be right in thinking that broadly reflects Highland Council stock as well?
Broadly, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
What then struck me very much was, it's easy to talk about stock and about figures and things like that, but when you get down to people, the people who are not necessarily in supported accommodation, I was thinking, for example, of someone who perhaps had lived in the family home for 50 years, caring for elderly parents, and is then left alone with a spare bedroom. So what we're basically saying is that's not your home anymore because you can't afford it, and we'll have to find you something else, which seems like a terrible indictment on our society if we have to do that. What that leads me on to is, yes, there's a huge concern about the viability of all the small housing associations, but there's a terrible concern too that we're going to lose the ethos of the housing providers that we have, in the way that we're going to be directed from elsewhere to treat people. And I wonder if that's something that has been taken on board by housing organisations, supported organisations, community-based housing associations and regionally based one. Is this something that voluntary management committees are talking about?
Yes,
yeah.
Very much so. And it's something that causes concern to them, but it also causes concern to our communities and to residents. I would say, despite our best efforts, we've done a lot of work in doing proactive publicity and issuing press releases, newsletters, targeted mail shots. The general understanding amongst our tenants is still very low, so I don't think we will have that until we're able to have one-to-one conversations with every tenant who is potentially affected. But where tenants have become aware, we've actually had one of our tenants, Mr. Guerin in Vanessa, actually developed a very proactive YouTube and Facebook campaign, which now has hundreds of members across the UK, and that has given us the opportunity to provide some very good case studies to the local press, who have taken this up very constructively, to show exactly the points that you're making, that this affects a whole range of people and will seriously impact on the ethos we've had to build good, mixed and sustainable and stable communities across our areas over a number of years. And I think I've had a lot of success in doing that. But we have single men who have access to children who are genuinely trying to maintain relationships with those children and have rooms for them to stay. We have people whose homes we've bought under the mortgage to rent scheme who we've received government funding to help people not be repossessed, who are now finding that they're under occupying. We've got people with severe disabilities in properties that have been heavily invested in and specially built for them in some circumstances, who now are left with spare bedrooms. People's families, children have grown up and left home, and people come and go. So there's a whole range, with a number of case studies that we've provided to MPs and MSPs through the course of our lobbying, a whole range of different circumstances that place people in those situations through no deliberate ploy on either their part or ours. It's just simply how people's lives and communities have evolved. And in some cases it will mean them being uprooted from communities where they've lived for a long, long time and have all their support networks and family networks in place, and will have to move, for example, with a case where with a tenant, a woman with a grown-up child living in the North Highlands who is now under occupying, and her most likely chance of getting an alternative-sized accommodation will be to move 20-30 miles nearer to Inverness. It's a huge upheaval in terms of small communities.
She loses her family home and she loses her community.
Yes, and it disrupts that community because there's the inevitable turnover and churn that then takes place within it. So yes, it is going to have a big impact. Yeah.
Thank you.
I had a question about supported accommodation, so it's maybe for Ken or Ian, I'm not sure, and maybe I'm just missing something, but you talked a little bit there, Ken, about the indications that the government will introduce a new system support, and I thought you were quite optimistic there might be an opportunity to improve it. It doesn't seem much going in that direction, but maybe. But you said there that you don't know how much that will be or how it will be constructed or administered, and the date you gave was 2014-15. But the other changes that we're talking about come in quicker than that. So, you know, the cap on the LHA, the under-occupancy rules, all of that stuff. I mean, is there a gap there that an organisation providing supported accommodation could fall down, where there's a period before the new system comes in, but the general changes have come in that actually could make it impossible to continue across that divide?
My understanding is that the exemption of supported accommodation from the universal credit is a short-term arrangement, and that there will be a longer-term system put in place. So the timescale is, as I understand, 13-14, but I guess that's for DWP to determine. Maybe I'm being over optimistic that there's an opportunity to influence that, but I guess we can but attempt to do that. One, by understanding the sector in Scotland, and in terms of how it's developed over the years. So I think the definition, well, that's a hard one to grapple with. I think we should be grappling with that and just trying to get our head around the numbers, how many people are going to be affected. In terms of the other points around the impact, the key impacts, I think, will be when people move on, because we've got, at least in the short term, a relatively safe haven for vulnerable young people, in our case. It's when they move on, and the limits in terms of choice, and sometimes it's no choice in terms of what they would move on to. So that, for me, is the real concern at this point in time. How that evolves going forward, I guess I'm not sure.
I'd just like to add, if I may, Mr. Gray, that certainly my interpretation is they're not looking until 2015 if this is going to be brought in. So it does, as Ken said, it gives us a chance to lobby. The trouble is we're not actually quite sure what we're lobbying for or lobbying to against what. That is a problem. It's a great grey area. For example, there's currently no real rules on what counts as support qualification, vulnerability. We've got exemptions. They think the current exemptions will exist. Well, what are all the current exemptions? Currently, it's if you're a hostel, for example, we are technically exempt, which is great. In the short term, is that going to be continued? Who's going to tell us? When are they going to tell us? How do we plan for the future? It's all about, I know it's all about definitions. But we can't accept the fact that it can't be defined somewhere. But we need to know, and we need to be involved, and certainly through Ken's organisation and through the committees that Ken's on. It's important, and we will certainly feed into it. But we need some decisions. We need advice, and certainly how is this going to go forward. The burning issue just now, as far as I'm concerned, is the current plan still to implement direct payments and online registration. That is a serious, serious issue to my organisation, and more importantly, to the individuals. Because we're talking about people here, not about buildings and everything else. It's about people, and it's people that are going to suffer. Not necessarily organisations, but if we collapse, the people will suffer. But the bottom line is, I've got people across the road who are saying, I can't possibly fill in a computer form. Will you do it for me? Of course we will. Will you phone up? We can today, but maybe not next week. Now, I know there's going to be an interim period whereby housing benefit offices, certainly in Edinburgh and Dundee, the two areas I primarily deal with, will have staff that we can continue that conversation, and that will be good. But what happens when the day comes and it isn't? If there isn't going to be a continuation of housing benefit, for example, controlled at local level for those that are vulnerable, that does give me serious issues. No, I don't know where it's going.
I mean, my second question kind of follows on from that, because it is about preparation in the sense of tenants and how they're prepared. And I just wondered, for example, with Albyn, what you've done, Helen, to make sure that people know this is coming, and to try and work with them to allow them to prepare for what are some pretty difficult circumstances that are coming their way, as you've described.
A range of things. When I've mentioned we've done various things in terms of press releases, newsletters. We've done targeted mail shots to people that we think we've identified the people who are likely to be under-occupying, people who are likely to be affected by increases in non-dependent charges, things like that. So we've done targeted mail shots to those. And I have a staff team that's very, very busily working away through those to see who's come back to them, who hasn't. Most people haven't. A very small number of tenants have actually come back to us. So we now have to start phoning around people and getting staff out and knocking on doors and saying, we've sent you this letter, you do realise what this implication is, don't you? And quite often the answer is no. And we then have to start having conversations with people about checking that their household circumstances are what we think they are, because people's circumstances change and we don't always know. Members come in and out of families and we don't always know who's come in and out. And looking with them at what their options are, and their options are whether we can provide a transfer, whether we can match them up with another tenant on our exchange list, and again, very close partnership working with other landlords in the area, and also with the private sector where there is one, in looking at where we can match people up and where there are potential for mutual exchanges, looking at working with other social enterprise and voluntary sector partners where we can create training and employability programs to help move people into work and off benefits where that's possible. We're looking at, in some cases, people won't be able to move, and we will have to work with them to go through their finances, to help them rebudget their household finances. Some people are saying to us, well, I simply can't move, I can't leave this area, or I have to stay in this house that my children can still visit. They're going to have to meet that shortfall of 14 or 25%, and we'll work with them to try and work the finances out to do that. But it is going to be extremely time-consuming, and it is going to be extremely resource-intensive, and the discussions I'm starting to have with my executive team and with our board is whether we can make additional staffing resources available to us to help our tenants through that process, because otherwise we're going to be extremely stretched. There will be tenants who simply can't pay, who can't manage to find that difference, because people's incomes are very, very marginal, and that presents a risk to us in terms of our rental income, which is at least 95% of our income is from our rent. So if that starts to go down, that starts to put other pressures on our budgets. We will be within the regulator's sights, and they will want to know what we're doing about it. So our board's going to have some very, very difficult decisions to make potentially, as we expect arrears to increase as well.
So you're saying really that in terms of getting people to be aware and understand the implications of the changes that are coming, really, in order to do that, your staff are having to go knock on their door and speak to them face to face, and nothing else is really having that impact.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you, Convener. Just picking up on a sort of a point that Helen was kind of alluding to a wee while ago, which is looking at wider societal impacts. I mean, I understand that anecdotally the UK government has come forward with two suggestions. I couldn't really describe either of them as helpful, which is that people could move to smaller accommodation, which we've seen is not necessarily easy, or they could take in a lodger. And I just wonder what you feel about those, particularly the latter suggestion, in the context of the realities of people's lives, particularly with respect to kinship carers and, as Helen alluded to, parents who have a contact order in their favour.
We've looked at our policy for lodgers to make sure that it's flexible enough to, I mean, all our tenants have the right to take in a lodger if they get in our permission. Our view is that we will take a permissive approach rather than a proactive approach. So we've looked again with our partners at whether we should have some sort of matching service to help people find lodgers. We're not keen to do that because we think it potentially places us in a very difficult situation. And if a tenant comes to us and says that they want to take in a lodger, we will agree, but we will also be saying to people, is this somebody that you know? Have you thought about the potential consequences of having somebody you don't know living in your household? Have you looked at what the risks might be, especially where people have children in the household or where they have access to children in the household? Again, I mentioned our single parent who's started a Facebook campaign. He is in exactly that situation where his children come to visit regularly on the weekend. We've discussed with him whether taking a lodger into his spare room is an option. It isn't, unless he can get somebody, a student or somebody who is only going to be there during the week and away at the weekends, because he simply wouldn't want to expose his children to the risk of somebody that he doesn't know. So whilst those are options that we will discuss with our tenants, and they will work for some people, they're not going to be viable options in all circumstances. So they're certainly not the solution in all cases.
Thank you.
Just a couple of questions then to finish. Throughout your evidence this morning, you've mentioned about the additional work that you're having to do, all of you, in talking to your clients and others. Have you done any assessment of the cost of this additional work, the one-to-ones that you're doing, the leafleting that you're doing, the additional resources that are required in order you to keep in touch with people?
Open this, Convener. I'm very fortunate we do that today, but I'm very narrow field. But we are dealing with our individuals on a daily basis, so our interaction is today. We wouldn't do any more because we actually currently do all, for example, the housing benefit. We've taught them through all the support things. So I'm very fortunate because we're doing that today. But coming back to if we're not getting the rent coming in, then we'll have to rethink how we actually go about our business. We've done a worst case scenario whereby all we provide is accommodation services or hotel services, and we try to import. That brings in the additional problem: who pays for the import, and how we're going to pay the import. But we looked at lots of scenarios. But I'm very fortunate just now. We are doing that interaction with people every day.
We've not managed to quantify what that is. We're continuing to work with individuals on a one-to-one basis.
In general, are you finding a resource implication involved in this?
I guess the resource has been more at this stage at the kind of management level, trying to understand the implications of the changes and mitigate that risk on the service. So it is boardroom discussion around risk management.
I'm not sure that we could quantify it exactly yet either. I mean, most of the time in terms of contact with tenants is being done within our existing resources. What we are starting to look at is what the additional resource requirement would be. So I'm not sure I could quantify that yet, but we're certainly moving towards that. In terms of the cost of mail shots, we haven't actually put a figure on that yet. I guess we'd be able to work it out, but we haven't done as of yet. It's just been within our existing resources so far.
And finally, that you've all mentioned, I think, either directly or indirectly, your the knowledge gap, the information or lack thereof coming from the Department of Work and Pensions. Can you give us an idea of just exactly how regular you are in discussions with the DWP and what information you're getting from them to try and close these gaps? Because it appears that a lot of what you're saying is predicated on what you think might be happening, but you don't actually know and haven't had confirmation. I mean, Mr. Ballantyne in particular talked in response to the question to Ian Gray about whether you'd be exempted or not. And there appears to be some information from DWP that there would be exemptions, but that's not been clarified to you. So you're still working on the basis of you're not quite sure where the situation is. So what sort of dialogue have you had with the DWP?
I've not personally had any direct dialogue. We tend to do it through the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, because it's a common theme throughout. But we've also been attending quite a few of the meetings where DWP have come up to Edinburgh and started talking. But what we've found is they have never been... you never get a direct answer to a direct question. And in many cases, and certainly one of them, as I went to the person that came up, didn't have the answers, and he freely admitted that there were concerns, not least of which was the IT system that's going to supposedly run this whole system. And I wait for the next DWP briefing up here in Edinburgh. But primarily we feed a lot of our questions through the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, because they're running a tally, for want of a better expression, on to see how far we can push it and see what the answers are.
Yeah. On that point, there is a UK Housing Benefit and Supported Housing working group with UK Housing, Homelessness and Support representatives meeting Lord Freud on a regular basis, although it doesn't seem very regular to me. Have you guys had any feedback from that actual working group, the UK working group, in terms of the issues that we're discussing today? Because I think, Convener, that should give an insight into the mind of the Minister, if nothing else. Has there been any contact between this group and your organisation?
Not directly, again, in a very similar position where we haven't had that direct contact as an organisation, but certainly through our member organisation, Scottish Federation of Housing Associations. We're in very close contact with the policy officers there, and they certainly produce regular briefings for the sector on information as they get it. So we would get the information through them or through the Chartered Institute of Housing, through our professional bodies.
A bit of information lacking in that regard.
Through the Supported Accommodation Group, it has representation from Community Care Provider Scotland, and Yvette Burgess there has been excellent in providing information in terms of the discussions going on at a UK and Scottish level. So that's been an important source of information for us, and there's been Scottish Government officials also involved to give advice to that group as well. At a local level, my experience has been that DWP have not been proactive. It's been the local authorities that have been proactive in trying to pull together working groups to look at the implications and mitigate any of the worst effects. And DWP have been involved in that, but again, it's a local point of contact. It's not somebody from further afield. So I think the issues, they haven't been that proactive, reactive when asked.
That's sort of the picture is you're getting some information through SFHA, some through the Community Care Providers Group, some through your local authority, but very little through DWP. We've been finding this as an issue, a recurring theme as we start to look at this issue, and I have to say, probably on behalf of the committee, I think I can speak on their behalf, that we're just not at all satisfied that the Department of Work and Pensions are engaging in this process in a way that informs and helps those either individuals who are going to transfer onto universal credit, or organisations like yourselves who are going to have to deal with the consequences of these changes. We put out this appeal to the Department of Work and Pensions, to the ministers, to come here and talk to us about these issues, but they refuse to come and talk to us. So I understand your frustration at not having the information. But I think we have to be absolutely clear on this committee that unless the Department of Work and Pensions start to engage in this process and openly and actively talk to us and to yourselves, that there is going to be a huge problem. We already know some of the practical difficulties, but there is going to be a huge problem when this system kicks in. And all the warnings that have been brought forward, all the information that's been put to us by different organisations, if it is not heeded, is going to lead to a situation in which there are going to be a lot of very vulnerable people, very important organisations who are not going to be able to function properly under this new system, and yet the DWP seems to be ploughing ahead regardless and not taking cognizance of the information that's coming to us, and it's just not acceptable. So the evidence that you've given us this morning has been very helpful in enlightening us in terms of the situation as it stands with you at the moment. So I welcome the information that you've given us, and thank you very much for coming to the committee this morning and having this dialogue with us. If there's anything that you want to pass on to us after you leave, something that might occur to you or something that develops that you think the committee might find useful, then please keep in touch with the committee and let us know how things are moving forward. But again, thanks very much to you all for your contribution this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I suspend for 5 minutes to allow a changeover? We come then to agenda item 3 this morning, which deals with the successor arrangements for the social fund. There are 2 elements to the committee's consideration of this item, and I propose to address each element in turn. The first of these is the arrangements that have been agreed between the Scottish Government and COSLA for the introduction of an interim scheme for the administration of this fund from April next year. And the second is to ask any initial questions that we might have in relation to the statutory instrument that will devolve responsibility for certain parts of the social fund. So looking at the first element, members will note the submissions that have been provided by the Scottish Government and COSLA. Does the panel that's in front of us have any comments that they want to make initially on this? No, so we just want to open up to any questions that colleagues might have. Ian?
No.
Ian, then Linda.
Just trying to call this.
I have come a little later to this than some colleagues because this is only my second meeting on the committee, so I might be going over ground that's been covered before, but I'm quite interested in the decision to replace a system which was part grant, part loans with a single system of grants. And I appreciate that in the consultation which was carried out, most, not all, but most of the respondents preferred that. But I'd be quite interested in the thinking behind replacing the crisis loan element of the previous system or the existing system with a grant.
So I can respond to that. I mean, I think there are 2 kind of points to make in response to that. One is very practical. Under the current arrangements, DWP has the option of recovering the loans through the benefit system. This isn't something that would be, certainly under the current devolution arrangements, available to the Scottish Government. So the overheads involved in recovering what are, in effect, very small amounts of money. I mean, the average crisis loan for living expenses is around about £52–55 per person. So the administrative overhead in actually recovering that without the ability to deduct it at source from social security benefits is very expensive. So we took the decision that, our ministers took the decision that from a practical point of view, that wasn't something that we would look at, certainly not for the interim scheme. The other broader point is it's questionable whether, I mean, we're dealing with vulnerable people on low income. It's questionable whether giving them a loan is a good thing when they find themselves in a crisis, rather than giving them a grant to help them out of that help them out of that particular situation. So that was the rationale between coming to the position that we're in.
I mean, I think that both those points make a great deal of sense. I just wonder what the impact is on the availability and the amount of resource that's available is then, though, because when we took evidence from the Cabinet Secretary on this, there was some discussion of that, and of course the Scottish Government have made additional funding available to do that. And we're provided with a table of previous expenditure on community care grants and crisis loans, and then what will be in place in the interim scheme. And I just wonder about these figures then, because one difference, of course, is that if you provide crisis loans, that money is recyclable, isn't it? Because in theory, at least, the money comes back in. And so, for example, there's a figure for 2011-12, what's £6.8 million in crisis loans. And I wonder then, was that the expenditure figure, or was that the figure of what was made available to those who were accessing crisis loans?
That was the figure that was made available to those that were accessing crisis loans.
So that included money which had come back in through being repaid.
I'm not quite sure how DWP organises finances, but yes, in theory. But my understanding is that even for DWP, the recovery rate for crisis loans is actually quite low. It's not 100% kind of recovery rate. So,
right, thanks.
Linda?
Well, I was just going to ask generally about. I know it's all very rushed, and I can see both from the Scottish Government submission and the COSLA submission that there's been a lot of work going on to try and meet the deadlines. And I wondered what the relationship with DWP was like in these terms.
I
think actually at kind of official level we have a fairly constructive discussion with, relationship with DWP. We're trying to engage at 3 levels, kind of within the core team within the Scottish Government. We have a relationship with the officials that are in DWP at the centre that are looking to localise welfare provision, which is what they call it in those terms. Through my colleagues in COSLA, we also have a kind of working relationship with the kind of operational managers in Scotland from a DWP perspective. And at the level of individual local authorities, we're certainly encouraging kind of closer partnership working with local DWP offices, because we're very conscious that from the point of view of the applicants, there will be a need for dialogue between DWP benefits and the new successor arrangements. So we're kind of conscious that there are 3 levels of engagement, and we're working to kind of maintain and kind of make sure that that's constructive at all those levels.
Yeah, I think I would echo that. I had a presentation last week to the DWP Scotland team in terms of welfare reform change, and that had a lot of operational managers around the table, and it was quite heartening to present to them and to listen to them in terms of the questions they were asking. There was a lot of recognition around the table at a local level of the work that they needed to do to make this happen, and it wasn't a case that they could wash their hands and move away. They needed to make sure that they were getting their stuff in place in a timely manner and communicating effectively, both with ourselves in terms of rolling out the new arrangements, but also through the transition period and indeed beyond.
But about at the next level, how ready do you think all the local authorities are?
As COSLA kind of we put in our submission, it is in the context of an enormously challenging timeline. However, I'm certainly impressed by the way that local authorities are taking this forward. We have a number of different forums that are established on the ground at practitioner level to try and meaningfully collaborate, to share the burden of workload, to try and communicate good practice with each other and to take things forward. It would be fair to say very obviously that different authorities are at different stages. Through COSLA and colleagues within Scottish Government, we're trying to make sure that we aren't letting anybody fall behind. We're trying to make sure everyone is at least getting good information. There are processes to go through, of course, democratic processes and others within individual authorities. Some are at the stage where they've formally determined where things are going to sit, from a decision-making perspective and a back office perspective. Some authorities are still wrestling with that problem. Some authorities have in mind how they're going to take it forward, but they're still going to formalise it. So we've got a mix and a spread. But within the project, if you like, at a national level, we've established a practitioners network meeting, which meets monthly, is so well attended, it's becoming difficult to manage, and we need to address that. We have a knowledge hub, which we've established with the Improvement Service, Scottish Government and ourselves. We've populated that with a lot of library documentation to ensure that people have good information at their fingertips. And hearteningly, we're starting to see individual local authority representatives putting their own reports up, job descriptions up, project plans, customer maps, so that instead of doing things 32 times, we're starting to see things being done once and being shared. It's not going to be one size fits all by any means, but at least people can take something, a template, move it forward, and we're sharing the burden as much as we possibly can across the board.
Just one final one, Convener. I know it may just be anecdotally that you can respond to this, but I just wondered, the level of engagement that local authorities themselves are having with their partners, like advice agencies, Citizens Advice Bureau, people like that, who are all going to be very involved at the front line of this issue.
I've been to physically been to about a dozen authorities, I would suggest, in recent weeks, and some of them have invited me to their kind of local project boards that have been in certainly example cases well attended with a real cross section of sectors, voluntary sector, health boards, DWP importantly, as well as individual departmental representatives from customer services to housing and homelessness, as well as revenues and benefits, and in the majority of cases looking at the verification and the decision making in relation to the national scheme and eligibility criteria. So in some cases some very good examples. Some authorities are maybe not quite there yet, and they're still having to wrestle with the processing side of things and how are they going to staff this, resource it, and move things forward. But I think generally, people are recognising that this is not just about processing a payment, it's about joining things up. And if we're going to do this better than is currently offered, which practitioners firmly believe they can, it's about supporting accessibility to the scheme and also importantly being creative and innovative in terms of the delivery mechanism. And even if we say no to some of these applicants, they will still be our customers. We need to make sure that they receive the right package of support and advice at the very least. And it may well be that that it's a rounded package in the majority of cases that someone needs to receive.
Thank you very much.
My question's partly been answered, Convener, and it is looking at things in the round. And I just wonder in terms of I think Mr Proudfoot said there's no universality here, and there never is in local government, let's be honest with you. In terms of actually putting these teams, along with welfare rights, other advice services, allowing contact with other agencies, as Linda has said as well, how many councils are looking at it that way and how many councils are looking at something different? I mean, from my perspective, it would be the ideal situation if there was a one-stop shop type scenario for these services, so that folk don't have to keep coming back for a crisis loan, but can be helped in other ways. That's the great hope, of course, but we're probably about to see huge amounts of folk get sanctions and other benefits and have to rely more and more on crisis loans. I wonder if Mr Proudfoot and Mr Gupta could maybe tell me what local authorities are doing in terms of that joined-up approach.
Could I just quickly respond about the longer term rather than the immediate, because there is quite a lot of discussion underway within the local authority associations across Britain and the DWP in this regard. There's been considerable lobbying from ourselves to say the additional pressures that we anticipate on communities and individuals and the families does need to be sized up, and establishment of proper face-to-face services which are resourced through DWP as a part of the burdens that are effectively transferring need further discussion. And it's only been, I think, over the last 2 or 3 weeks that we've now entered into the territory of task forces being put together, which involve the different local authority associations, some of those who are doing pilot work with the universal credit delivery and the like. So we're
saying that it's only the last 2 or 3 weeks that these task forces have been put together. Now, some folk out with this room today will think to themselves, why is it that this has only just happened? Could you explain why it has taken so long to get to that stage? Is that because of a lack of information from DWP? The fact that amounts of cash that is being given to local authorities elsewhere and the Scottish Government has only been known very recently. Is it their delay that has caused task forces only just recently to be formed?
It is, in my view, the DWP having taken a considerable amount of time to respond to the lobbying that has been ongoing for quite some time from local authority associations. And I believe a view from DWP now that they do need to move forward at some pace. So we are involved with meetings, I think possibly on a weekly cycle is what is intended, which is frankly quite difficult to resource from our point of view. But just picking up a little bit on what Douglas was saying earlier, we're also quite anxious to try and create a permissive environment for these discussions about the longer-term face-to-face to take place in. And by that I mean ones that recognise specifically the peculiarities and the strengths of delivery in Scotland, taking into account community planning partnership arrangements and, frankly, also the fairly good relationships that we do have with DWP district officers, amongst others.
Just maybe to follow up on your point on consistency, obviously that's very important that, you know, the customer journey, and we are talking about a particularly vulnerable group here, is not vastly different between one authority and the next. And then, you know, the national guidance is obviously very important in that respect. Through the consultation period in August, quite a bit came back from local authorities looking for more of a steer in terms of enabling that consistency, and we're working with Scottish Government. The latest version of the draft guidance is more helpful in that respect, and we're working with Scottish Government to form a decision makers toolkit, which will again try and give a flavour across all the authorities to the decision makers, such that they can be prioritising at a consistent type of level within the confines of the scheme. It would be fair to say that through all these forums that I mentioned before, we're trying to not stifle innovation. We want to recognise that there are differences that work in different areas, but we're trying to make sure that there is consistency at the same time. I know I'm talking about contradiction here, but consistent principles locally delivered, and that's what we're trying to achieve. And practitioners right across local authorities have a fairly good grasp in that respect.
But it makes sense to me, I have to say.
Annabelle.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. I had a question on the second part of this morning's proceedings.
I haven't got there yet.
Haven't got there yet? Okay.
Deal with it separately. A couple of questions I have in relation to things we've already touched on. I think everyone's made it clear that there's been an identification of the need to have good connectivity between all the different organisations. And there are a number of organisations out there who are going to be affected, so Citizens Advice, carers organisations, issue-specific organisations. And you've indicated that you know you need to connect all these things together. But in terms of signposting individuals who are coming for crisis loans, what sort of training is being provided to those who would be given the advice and doing the signposting to ensure that people got pointed in the direction of where this support would be?
That's kind of very much one of our next big tasks. We're very conscious now that we're kind of getting towards the end of the first kind of full iteration of the guidance, that our next task with COSLA is to work up a kind of fully scoped training programme that will probably be delivered in February of next year. We've agreed with COSLA and local authority representatives that a kind of train the trainer approach is the best way of approaching this task. So we will provide a centralised kind of training scheme for the trainers, or probably 2 people for each local authority, or at least 2 people from each local authority, so that they can go back and deliver their own training, and putting together the list of kind of topics or modules that we want to address during that training programme. Signposting is one of the things that's on the list. So with COSLA and local authority representatives and through the Welfare Reform Scrutiny Group, we need to kind of begin to populate what that signposting might look like. There's also separately, there's some work that we're doing with SCVO, looking at a kind of mapping exercise about the type of provision that's available for specific groups on a geographical basis, and we're hoping that that work can kind of fit into this broader scoping work that we'll be doing with COSLA and individual local authorities in the context of the training programme.
It's helpful to know that type of work's ongoing. Having spoken to a number of organisations out there, and sometimes it's just the fear of what might happen rather than any examples of something actually existing. But it has been brought to my attention a couple of times that people are concerned that there might be, and I'd never heard this phrase before, but it's something that's becoming familiar to me, is cost shunting. I see Mr. Gupta nodding, so obviously there is something out there about this. There's a fear that with the new fund coming into place, that people will consider that to be an alternative to the existing provision of social services and others, and that they will shunt people towards the crisis loan rather than towards aids and adaptations or social service support. Given that you've nodded, Mr. Gupta, do you want to comment on that?
I probably shouldn't nod. It's, I think, also from a very global perspective that generally the cuts in the level of benefits will result in what we're calling cost shunting to three main areas: the crisis loans element, the obligations on councils through their social work functions to provide funding there, as well as the discretionary housing payments. So it's essentially that as individuals' budgets tighten up, they'll become more vulnerable, and they will make greater use, perhaps, of already existing arrangements, albeit them in the case of the Scottish Welfare Fund, once transferring to different deliverers. So it's that in part, and there's also, as part and parcel of this, concern that, again, as DWP start trying to withdraw themselves from face-to-face services and work primarily with a computerized system, that there will be in effect, people coming to a whole variety of other organisations to deliver the services that they're currently doing. So you're just seeing that element of current costs shunted over to different agencies.
Alex, you wanted to...
We've heard about how different organisations are preparing themselves for change, and I get the impression that, without naming any organisations, I get the impression that different organisations may be at a different place in terms of their preparation and their readiness. Now, local authorities, I think, are right up there as an example of a group who are genuinely ahead of the game, if that's possible in this process. But do you have any concerns about any of the organisations, which may or may not have been named during this discussion, and whether they are all advancing themselves towards the point they need to be?
I mean, certainly from a local government perspective, I've got in my own mind a fairly good idea where we are generally across the piece. We're engaging with other sector organisations and specific organisations for certain aspects of the guidance and the new arrangements as they're going to come in, and we're engaging too with other sectors in terms of trying to take forward some of the additional supporting work that we're moving on with. For example, to help decision makers interpret the guidance consistently, we're going to be working with CAS, for example, to identify scenarios and get them involved within the process, and so too on the communication side of things and rollout. A lot of different things are happening with different organisations within different authorities, and that's certainly fair to say, and that's slightly beyond my reach. Although I have an awareness, and we've certainly offered, to all practitioners, if there's an opportunity to help advise, help bring people up to speed, then we'll try and facilitate that as much as possible. But they really are the experts within their own area.
Just to explain myself a little more, when we take evidence and we talk to people about the welfare process, it's sometimes easy to see that some people are on the front foot on this and some are still on the back foot. And my concern is that, we're talking to you today and you're very much on the front foot in my view. There are others who are still have concerns, are uncertain, are not sure about how they have to deal with this process. Are you confident that all the organisations we've discussed today are in a position to be on the front foot and interact appropriately?
I think it's quite a difficult one to answer, partly because as the welfare reform process being steered by DWP rolls out in a slightly unpredictable way, it is quite difficult to know quite how prepared people should be and for what. So, for instance, whilst we've got the housing benefits changes coming into play much sooner than the rest of the universal credit-related changes, it then means that, for instance, people who may be anxious about how they will be affected by universal credit probably aren't going to be predictable in when they will come forward seeking advice and support. Some of that will clearly, we anticipate workloads developing from the point that the Greater Manchester Pathfinders come on, but in effect, that will only cover about 5,000 or so families, as far as I'm aware. But there will be people then coming, presumably, to the advisory agencies and service deliverers within Scotland on the back of what will be a very high degree of public interest and media interest into what happens there. But in reality, there's not likely to be immediate major effects until we get probably up to 2014, around the start of the next financial year, 2014-2015. There will be some rollout, but it'll be quite limited from what we understand from October 2013 in Scotland. So I'm just trying to say, I think there are concerns, and we will be wanting to use the amount of time that we have available, partly to develop some of that face-to-face services, which will, of necessity, include us working closely with other people who have an interest in this area. But it's a difficult task at the moment to size the task itself.
If I may just kind of briefly in relation to the Scottish Welfare Fund, we're very conscious that this is something discrete and specific that will start in Scotland from next April. So we recognise that we will need to develop an appropriate communication strategy for that, so that the individual people who might previously have gone to DWP for a community care grant or a crisis loan will know to go to their own local authority for a community care grant or a community care grant or a crisis grant after April. And we're actually just this Wednesday, actually, we're having the first meeting of a kind of subgroup that we've set up with COSLA, with local authority representatives, with some of my colleagues from the communications teams within the Scottish Government, to think about the kind of the messages that we need to portray and the types of channels that we might use to make sure that the people that need to know about this change are fully up to speed by the time the new scheme comes in place from the beginning of April. So there will probably be a briefing note for MSPs, a briefing note for councillors. We're thinking through the types of different levels of kind of information that we need to put out there, and make sure that that's widely available in the public domain before April. So watch the space. Probably sometime round about end of January, we're probably thinking might be the most appropriate time to start to ramp up some of the public communications about this.
A couple of things, we were talking about preparedness there, and a couple of things which are important but not clear yet, I think, and I just wonder where discussions have reached on that. One is the distribution of the fund amongst local authorities.
It's been discussed at the Joint Settlement and Distribution Group with COSLA and Scottish Government. The proposal is that the programme funding and the admin funding will be distributed on the basis of historical spend. We have fairly robust data from DWP at spend by local authority level for last 2 years. So that's the basis that we would we envisage distributing the fund initially, with a view to looking to something that's more needs-based in the longer term.
Yeah, and that's quite important because the guidance talks quite a lot about the obligation on local authorities to budget across the year, because the budget canon will run out. And within the guidance, there is a review process, but that process doesn't apply where an application is refused on the grounds that the budget has run out. Why is that? Why no review if the decision is taken on that basis?
Do you want to talk about?
Actually, in the latest version of the guidance, looked at that again because it wasn't clear exactly what that meant. The decision on making an award is based on a priority basis. So there's no right of review based on the level of priority set within that month. So at the beginning of each month, the local authority will make a judgment for budgeting whether it can pay out on high priority, high and medium, or high, medium and low priority. And if what we're saying in the guidance now is that there isn't a right of review against that budgeting decision at the beginning of the month. There's a right of review of the level of priority that's been applied to your application. So if a local authority was only paying out on high priority applications and you were judged to be medium, you could request a review of that. But you can't request a review of the local authority's decision that they can't afford to pay out on anything more than high priority at that stage.
Okay, well, if there's new guidance, that's something maybe we'll be able to look at again in the future. But the other thing which was missing was the second tier review, which, of course, in the social fund, the potential for review to the commissioners has been very important historically. And I just wonder if you've made any progress in replacing that.
That's a very current piece of work, and we completely recognise the value that people place on an independent aspect to second tier review. What's difficult is that it hasn't been possible to find an organisation in Scotland that could carry out that in addition to its existing duties, and to set up something bespoke was never really possible in the time and would be extremely expensive. So we're having to look at how we balance off independence against practicality and cost, because these are quite small scale administrative awards of money, and if you look at that from a perspective of never having had an independent review, it'd be unlikely that you would put in place the situation that's in the UK, or the independent review service that's there at the moment. So we're having to look at how we balance off practicality and cost against the independence. We will hope to come up with something that will at least satisfy as many people as we can.
I think that finishes off the questions we have around the first part. I probably should check though, just to be fair, because I did talk about the communication or lack thereof from the DWP towards the Scottish Government and others. So just to check, probably a question more for COSLA, but are you happy with the level of information you're getting from the Scottish Government?
Yes.
Right. Okay. Always got to be seen to be fair. Okay, so we go to the second part, as indicated earlier, the statutory instrument. Do members have any initial comments or questions about this? Anil?
Yes, thank you, Convener. Looking at the Section 30, and obviously I would say I'm pleased to see that we're working our way through Schedule 5 slowly but surely in terms of reserved matters that are no longer reserved. I just wonder, it seems that the timescale for this is quite tight, and I would imagine that we here in the Scottish Parliament would not have any difficulty in meeting the tight timescale. But I just wonder if there's any information about what's happening in Westminster, given that both houses have to approve the order.
I haven't got specific dates, but as you'll be aware, it's the Scotland office that actually managed the process through the House of Commons and the House of Lords. We have a timetable through which we are working, which makes sure that it will be in place by the necessary date. And when I last checked with the Scotland office last week, they have no concerns about that timetable being met.
Can I ask, Convener, by what date then do Westminster have to sign off? Before?
I'm sorry, I don't have the specific date. I know that our intention is for it to go to the February meeting of the Privy Council, and the introduction date has been set to enable that to happen.
Thank you.
Points or questions on this? Okay, I have had one issue brought to my attention. It was a pretty technical point, but it needs to be clarified. Rather than needing an immediate answer, though, if you can get back to me, if you have the information, all well and good, but if you need to get back to me, that would be just as acceptable. Article 2.3 of the order sets out the points at which two pieces of legislation would be considered to be frozen from the point of view of interpreting the scope of welfare benefits that will remain reserved under the Scotland Act. One of those points is given as a date in the past, so we can be certain of what the Parliament is being asked to agree to. However, the other point is given as a date in the future, which means that as the legislation is concerned is not devolved. that the Parliament is being asked to agree to an interpretation of something that could be amended between the instrument being approved and coming into effect, over which the Parliament has no control. So could the Government clarify whether my understanding of this position is correct? And if so, how the Parliament can be confident that it knows that what it's being asked to agree to?
This is why I brought my colleague.
I'll take the hint that you want a written answer, so we'll hear an answer.
Okay, if there are no other questions, can I thank you all very much for the information you've given us this morning. And I'll suspend again for a few minutes to allow us to change the witnesses. Okay, agenda item 4 is to allow the committee to hear evidence from the Scottish Government and COSLA on the basis of the council tax reduction scheme that will operate from the year from April 2013 to April 2014. The Scottish Government officials will outline the basis of the scheme and then we'll move to questions. So thanks very much for you all coming to speak to us this morning. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Good morning. We're very grateful to the committee for inviting us here to talk about the regulations that were laid last week. Perhaps if I could say a few words just to confirm the need for these regulations being brought to the Parliament. The note prepared by the committee clerk refers to the abolition of council tax benefit from April 2013. From then on, assisting the vulnerable to meet their council tax liability will cease to be part of the social security system. Rather, it will become part of the local taxation system. Subject to the will of Parliament, these regulations will therefore provide the legal basis for implementing the policy response, Scottish ministers and COSLA agreed in April of this year. They create a scheme of reductions to council tax that would result in individuals having the same net council tax liability, assuming their circumstances were otherwise unchanged, upon the abolition of council tax benefit. That is, if the regulations didn't come into force, local authorities would have no alternative except to bill everyone for the full amount of council tax due. These regulations relate to people of working age. There will be an equivalent set of regulations coming forward very shortly for people of pension age. It may be helpful, I don't know, feel free to stop me, if I offered just a very brief description of how the system of council tax reductions would compare to the present council tax benefit. To begin, in drafting these regulations, we sought to adapt, where appropriate or possible, the entitlement criteria that is presently set out in the council tax benefit regulations. And this was in part to ensure that we would fulfil the policy objective of ensuring that entitlement to a council tax reduction replicated as much as possible existing entitlement. But also, I think it's fair to say it's a recognition that the timescale that was imposed upon us meant there was no other realistic alternative approach. The most fundamental difference between these regulations and the present council tax benefit is that they reduce an individual's council tax liability. It's quite a point of profound principle. It's not about entitlement to a social security benefit. So on the ground for local authorities, it means that they will cease to be managing access to public funds, rather it will be managing variations on their own council tax base. For somebody who has applied for and is entitled to reduction, this means they will still receive a council tax bill, but one that reflects that their liability has been reduced. And by way of comparison, someone who is presently in receipt of council tax benefit, they receive a council tax bill, but one that has been reduced to reflect the fact that DWP has paid some or all of it. So whilst there is this profound difference between the present arrangements and the regulations in front of us, there will be a lot that is deliberately familiar to both the delivery community and also to those presently entitled to council tax benefit. I don't know, I'll pause there and just say if it's helpful I can try and give a very brief description of how entitlement to a council tax reduction would be deduced or calculated.
I think if we allow the committee to ask questions that are in their heads at the moment, it might get to that clarification. If they're still outstanding at the end, it might be useful to do that. I'll open it up to colleagues if you want to ask. Alex?
I'm going to ask a very simple question. Could I ask COSLA to tell us whether you think it's as simple as it was just explained?
I think from our point of view, what we are looking for is obviously a scheme that matches as far as possible what is the current provision to benefit recipients. Robin has been at lengths to explain to us why it has to be different, because one of the questions was why could we not just replicate exactly what had been there before. I think we do understand that it is not a benefit. It is effectively it's now transferred to the council tax side of things purely, and there are machinations that are required around that. So hopefully Robin can give more detail if that's needed. But from our point of view, what we feel is that the regulations, one, I would say that we will obviously welcome the fact that the regulations are now being laid in Parliament, and that this does give a great deal of confidence and certainty to the local government community, who have actually been having to bring about the implementation, but have had to do that a little bit, in waiting on the regulations then coming into place. So there's been a little bit of trust, if you like, in terms of that. So it's we're greatly encouraged that the regulations are there now, and that really pretty much just allows the councils to get on and get this implemented.
So you're confident that the regulation that has been laid before Parliament is workable, functional, and deals with the issues that were set before the government.
I mean, as far as possible, yes, I think we are confident in that regard. We have had local government practitioners who have been involved in looking at the regulations. Obviously, you can only see how things are going to be when it all actually comes to be, and we're actually operating the scheme. But the local government practitioners have fed back and have given Robin hopefully a lot of pointers to help the government in bringing about the regulations in a way that's going to be workable.
I want to hear from the front line, and I want to know what Ms Deans has to say about it all. No disrespect to COSLA, but I know that you're at the coalface. What do you think of what's been laid before us?
I think I'd echo what Jonathan has said, and the most important thing for us really is having something in place for the 1st of April. If we were to get to February and March, when we are usually doing our annual billing and exercise for council tax, and didn't have a scheme in place, then I think that would be very difficult for us. Part of what we've been doing at the moment is really having contingency planning in place for if that wasn't to happen. But we have some faith in the regulations being ready for that. So we're preparing all, in the same way as we would normally prepare for council tax billing. And because the intention of the scheme is to replicate the entitlement levels as they are, that actually makes our job a little bit more straightforward as well, because we're not really bringing in something that's fundamentally different to the person in the street. So in terms of what they'll see on their council tax bill, it will look really similar. They'll see this in as a reduction rather than as council tax benefits. So, the actual customer front end of this, provided the regulations do act as we expect them to act, should be no significant change for local authorities. There is change, though, on the system side for local authorities, though, and there'll be we have been, and I know other local authorities have been, along with Scottish Government and COSLA, engaging with the software suppliers for the main revenues and benefits systems. They've been working on planning for this replacement scheme for a while. Obviously affects the whole of the UK, so we've been feeding back our requirements for this scheme to our suppliers, and obviously that's going to take a little bit of activity from their side, and obviously a bit of cost on the side of the suppliers for IT implementation as well, and we're working towards having that available to us in January, February, so that we're ready for our council tax billing.
Convener, if I can follow up on the IT side, because obviously there's no uniformity across the board there either. Are you aware of any of the software systems that are currently being used by local authorities in Scotland where it might be difficult to make these changes? Patching is often a phrase that I hear used in terms of some of these software systems. Is there any one that you're aware of that we may find difficulty with?
I'm aware that there are differences in the systems. I'm most familiar with the system that we use in my authority. I can't speak for all of the software suppliers or all of the local authorities, but I'm fairly confident that the suppliers that we deal with have got a track record of delivering this kind of change. But it's quite significant. As you can imagine, the calculation for housing benefit and council tax benefit is really entwined in the systems. So they have to disengage that, and we're looking to disengage housing benefit and council tax benefit so that it'll allow us to pay the new council tax reduction separately. So it is going to be quite a significant difference. And I think there will be some peculiarities of IT systems that make it more difficult for some suppliers than others. And there may well be some things that we won't be able to do automatically in the first instance. That we may have to put some manual processes into place, and that might be the case across the board, and might be the case in one or two particular systems. We don't have all the answers to that yet, but in terms of the broad calculation, my understanding is that most of the software suppliers will be able to deliver that.
I wonder if Jonathan's aware of any problems in any local authorities.
We're not. We've not received feedback that suggests that councils would have difficulty in terms of their software suppliers. I guess the key issue that's coming back to us from councils is effectively who's going to pay for this, and that is still a pretty moot point from our point of view, and obviously we've had discussion with Scottish Government and with obviously with the ministers around this, and the key to us is that that money should come from the UK Government. This is a policy change by them, so that probably is what causes the most anxiety. It's not the actual implementation, it's who's going to pay for it.
Linda?
Well, it was generally IT, maybe a bit unjustified, but I'm always filled with horrible thoughts when I think of these big IT changes. Kevin beat me to it, but I was, you did say, June, that you had been working contingency planning in case there wasn't a replacement scheme. Have you got a contingency plan in case the computer systems don't work?
Yeah, same thing. We've got those kind of levels in place. They're not especially detailed because we have enough confidence that we think things will be in place on time. But
this is going in the record.
But we do have outline plans in place, for example, if we were either not to have a scheme or not be able to facilitate that scheme through our systems. Now that is going to be a very serious consideration for local authorities if we are needing to send council tax bills out without having a council tax reduction on them. Then there are a number of different avenues that we might go down for that, but there would be difficult decisions to take, and each local authority may take a different approach to that.
Thank you. That was all for you.
Thank you. Just picking up something that Jean said, so going forward there'll be a disengagement of the housing benefit from the council tax benefit, and we all understand the reasons for that. We've just had a session earlier this morning about the impact of the new housing benefit changes. But I just wonder, so in light of the fact that we heard of all the difficulties that will take place, not least because of the payment of the housing benefit direct to the recipient, where's all this useful information about the housing benefit going? Because it seems that the lack of this information is going to cause various organisations, including, I would imagine, Glasgow City Council, housing associations, the length and breadth of Scotland, supported accommodation providers, enormous problems. I mean, what happens to this information? Does it just kind of go into the ether, or what happens to it? On the housing benefit side, you said that there were going to be a disengagement of the council tax benefit and the housing benefit information. Where's the housing benefit information that's currently on this system? Where's it going? Is it just gone?
I mean, I think in terms of if you're looking at 2013-14, the increasing likelihood is that there is not going to be a huge amount of change in terms of how councils administer their effectively their joint housing benefit and council tax support arrangements. I think what will happen, obviously, is that the government is committed to bringing in universal credit. It does look as though it's happening just a little bit slower than they had originally intended, which is probably comes as some relief, I think, to ourselves. But I think the key point is that in terms of, I mean, it's whether it's simply the systems aspect of that, or whether it's the actual wider implications of the housing, the changes in terms of housing benefit moving to universal credit, and the various other changes that are coming in terms of reducing housing benefit to individuals. These all carry major implications for our local authorities, and they are areas that we don't have the sort of answers we would like to have. If you look across the piece in regard to these, looking at universal credit, for example, even though we can see it's been delayed and may not have so much of an impact in 13-14, what we don't have is a migration timetable for that. So we don't know how really the disaggregation, if you like, is really going to take place at the moment, and that's something that we're obviously pressing DWP to get answers on. There are other changes coming in under occupancy, for example. There's a major change coming in that will actually affect the systems that our councils operate. They will have to look at different processes in terms of that, both in terms of identifying who those people are and also in actually supporting and actually managing those people, because if they do start to fall into arrears, that will be a major issue for our council. So I suppose what I'm really saying is that, and hopefully that's kind of answering what you're asking, is that we're not doing the council tax support in isolation here. It is being done at a time. We've got, you've talked about the social fund as well. We've got other systems coming into place. There are impacts right across the board. So we're having to look at all of that. It's not simply just that we're looking at this. But in terms of the council tax support, I think, our feeling is there will be some more work that we need to do to actually just clarify the practical aspects of this. And we will have a further discussion with the Scottish Government about that, and whether there are areas that need to be ironed out. But in terms of the council tax support, I think we can get that in without too much disruption to our local authorities and to our communities. But it's not been done in isolation. That's the point.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question? I'm not sure if any of you can answer this, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. The assumptions that you're working towards, are they the assumptions made by the Department of Work and Pensions, which appear to me to have been based on statistics as they were in May, when the projections of a 2% decrease in the pressure on council tax benefit? Now, since May, there have been a lot of redefining of the economic expectancy over the next year that this system's going to run. So are you still working to that projection of May, or are you working to your own assumptions and projections? Because it appears to me that while across the UK the figures are showing decreases in unemployment, the employment figures appear to be being bolstered by part-time employment, which would mean that a number of people will still remain on benefits. And secondly, in Scotland, the figures last month indicated an increase, which would potentially mean that the growth figures here are not going to match the projections of the UK. I mean, are you working to your own figures, or are you relying on the DWP to get this right?
I assume you're referring to the quantum of money that will be transferred to the Scottish budget upon the abolition of council tax benefit. As far as I understand, the final amount to be transferred will be based on forecasts by DWP but endorsed by the Office for Budget Responsibility of the cost of council tax support next year, minus 10%. And the final forecast will be published at the time of the Chancellor of the Exchequer's autumn statement, which, if memory serves, is on the 5th of December. We are aware of the sort of issue that you have mentioned, and I think well, certainly it's been raised both at official level and political level with counterparts in Whitehall and Westminster. Nevertheless, it is the Office of Budget Responsibility, so contestably they are as definitive a provider of forecasts as anyone. We ourselves don't have any forecasts of the cost of support for next year. But there is a very clear political agreement to maintain a dialogue between Scottish ministers and local authorities as the scheme operates next year.
Okay, that's helpful. I think maybe we won't go back to any more questions, but you did look to give us the opportunity of some technical information on the implementation. Do you want to take the opportunity now, Mr. Haynes, and we'll wrap it up at that?
I don't know if the committee would find it helpful if I tried to give just a very brief overview of how entitlement to...
Yeah, I think it might be helpful if you could.
And it certainly might help to explain why you have 130 pages in front of you. First and foremost, entitlement to a council tax reduction will be means tested, and it will require 3 key elements of each application to be determined. First of all, the applicant's total council tax due needs to be identified, which sounds quite simple, but some of the provisions in the regulations exist to identify other people in the household who might be expected to make a contribution to the council tax, and these are referred to as non-dependent deductions. Next, the applicant's income and savings needs to be defined, and there's a whole part of the regulations that is about defining what the income of someone who is self-employed. There are schedules which refer to which income is treated as income and which is disregarded. Lastly, the applicant's living expenses needs to be determined, and in council tax benefit and council tax reduction parlance, that is called the applicable amount. And that is about determining whether the applicant is single or lives as part of a couple, whether they have dependents, whether they have children, whether they have a disability, what the degree of disability is, whether they have caring commitments, and so forth. And it is the requirement to, if you like, nail each of these elements that contributes to some of the complexity and length of the regulations. If the net income, that is, the income is less than or the same as the applicable amount, then the applicant is entitled to a reduction of 100% of their weekly council tax. If their income is above the applicable amount, the amount of reduction is tapered, and the reduction is reduced by 20 pence for each £1 their income is over the applicable amount. And there's no entitlement to reduction if the residual income is 5 times greater or more than the council tax liability. Entitlement criteria to certain benefits, specifically job seekers allowance, income support, income-related employment support allowance, and guaranteed pension credit, are such that recipients are automatically entitled to 100% of their a 100% reduction of their eligible council tax, and that's sometimes referred to as passporting. As I've said, much of the complexity and length of these regulations derives from the need to define the income, the savings, the allowable living expenses of the applicant, and the actual calculation once those figures are reached is actually quite easy. I have a list of the differences between the council tax benefit and the reductions. I don't know if it would be helpful if I left that with the clerks for you.
So yeah, it'd be good to have a record, yeah.
Can I ask that? In broad brush, are the differences as between the old and the new substantial, or not substantial but technically relevant?
The policy intention is that if somebody receives council tax, is entitled to council tax benefit at present, and their circumstances are unchanged, then their net council tax will be the same. There are a couple of minor differences. One example I could give you would be the treatment of income from war pensions, ex-servicemen pensions and so forth. At present, local authorities have some discretion about how much of this income is disregarded in the assessment of the applicant's income. Whereas, in point of fact, all local authorities in Scotland choose to disregard the entirety of income from war pensions. And the legal powers under which these regulations are made mean that we cannot reproduce that discretion. So the regulations reflect what actually happens in Scotland, in that they compel authorities to disregard all war pension income.
That's been really helpful, so thank you very much to you all for coming this morning, and we'll no doubt continue to look at this as it progresses further. And again, you'll yeah. If you have any other technical information which you think would be useful to the committee, if you could send it to the clerks, would be really helpful. But thanks very much for your time this morning. Thank you. Okay, we only have one more item on our agenda, which is in private, so I'll suspend for a few minutes just to allow us to clear the room.